ご機嫌いかがですか? Watanabe Dan desu. Today we're going to cover a rather controversial issue, and that is, why does Hollywood, especially modern Hollywood, seem to hate women so much? Now, you might think that that's a very hyperbolic statement, and before, if someone had said that to me, I would have said, you're out of your mind. First of all, yes, Hollywood has had a little bit of gender inequality in terms of the C-suite and in upper level management and in certain above the line professions, but overall, women in Hollywood have fared very well over the long term. Now, let me define that position and give you the historical background of why I think women are, in fact, hated by Hollywood right now, but weren't in the past. And that is that going back in Hollywood history over 100 years to the 19 teens, when Hollywood first started being a really big deal, most of the movies were made with the understanding that the core audience was women. Now, this might come as a surprise to many people because a lot of times, in terms of the historicity of entertainment, a lot of it was indeed written by men, with the exception of someone like Molly Haskell and From Reverence to Rape in the 1970s and stuff like that. But overall, a lot of Hollywood history was written largely from a male perspective. And so a lot of times it had certain innate biases, which weren't necessarily ununderstandable, but were definitely in place. And so a lot of the history was written from the perspective of male-oriented movies. And yet, if you look at the box office, if you look at what the moguls were doing, and remember, these moguls were hardly educated with finishing school degrees that showed that they were completely up to date or an au courant, well, at least from a teens and 20s perspective, of academic discourse in gender equality. No, they weren't. But they knew what audiences liked, and they knew how to canter their movies to the largest audience. And if you look at most of the early movies, they had a lot of emotional content, and that went across the board. Take, for example, Charlie Chaplin and Playing the Little Tramp. What was one of his biggest hits? One of his biggest hits was The Kid, and it's all about a father type figure who's trying to keep control, keep custody of an orphan boy, played by Jackie Coogan. And that movie absolutely played on the character's emotional context. You see the people who represent the law trying to take the boy away from the kid, and the boy screaming and crying, and Charlie Chaplin chasing him across the roofs. Yes, there was athleticism in it, but there was also that really, really strong emotional content. Then you have some of the biggest stars of that era. There was Little Mary, Mary Pickford, who was playing the gamin, the tomboyish girl who nonetheless was a solver of all of life's problems. She became so rich and powerful that she and Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith and a bunch of others formed United Artists as a way to continue making movies together. She and Douglas Fairbanks, very He-Man type hero, ended up moving to what was called no man's land, because being Jewish, they were not allowed to buy property in the swanky area of Los Angeles. So they go way out into the hinterlands and found Beverly Hills. So this was really one of the powerhouses of filmdom. Look at Gloria Swanson. Now, today we remember her mostly from playing the tragic Norma Desmond, delusional and all of that in Sunset Boulevard. But Gloria Swanson, as an icon of fashion and of feminine pulchritude and power, was an enormous influence. In fact, how many of you have main bedroom attached bathrooms? And when you look at that, what do you think? Do you know that came from Gloria Swanson's Cecil B. DeMille movies? In all of those movies, you would always have a bathtub scene where you would have this fantastic bathroom that couldn't possibly exist in real life. where she would come in and be surrounded by her duennas and servants, and she would get into this sunken bathtub. Well, guess what? In New York City, among the swells, among the really rich people, all of a sudden, bedrooms started getting taken over to become the so-called master suites. And ever since then, those enormous bathrooms have become the sign of having arrived. Even if it's in a tract house in a new development, you still have that embodiment from Gloria Swanson's appearance and her role as a major star. Plus, it became apparent even in the 1920s that movies were broken into two types. One of them was the A picture, and these were movies that had an emotional content that was driving them. And then you had the A pictures, which were the spectacles, and which were admittedly more skewed toward males. The general ratio between the two was you would have two of the A pictures for every one of the tentpole pictures. And that seemed to be a common a blend, because if you were watching movies, who was making the decision? Alfred Hitchcock points this out, that when a couple, now remember, Alfred Hitchcock is saying this before we have all this different kind of families and all that. When Alfred Hitchcock was saying this, it was in the more traditional family era. And Alfred Hitchcock used to say, whenever a couple goes to see a movie, not only does the woman usually pick what movie they go to see, she also decides whether or not they liked it. And that held true for decade after decade. If you look at the big stars in Hollywood, you might have had a male at the top, whether it be Clark Gable or Paul Newman or Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt, but right below them, there would be a whole plethora of female stars. And most of these female stars were not your pretty little Betty Grable type things. They tended to be very different looking women, very strong personalities, who are also what we would today call transgressive. What do I mean by that? I mean that they were willing to meet men at their own level. They were willing to use their sexuality if that's what it took, but they were never anybody's fool. You had actresses such as Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, not classically beautiful, Barbara Stanwyck, always being the leads. And that carried through into the 1950s. Jane Wyman, you had, admittedly, you would have Lana Turner, but Lana Turner reached some of her biggest peaks when she was what would today be considered rather old. And she was no longer just a beauty, but she had this other side to her that had a maturity to it. So you had a very, very different kind of woman, a woman who was not the norm. Then you had on television, the new medium. Who was the biggest star of that era? It was Lucille Ball. And Lucille Ball became a big name by playing a character who was anything but your traditional housefrau. Yes, she would do the housewife thing, but she always said she wanted to be in show business. She wanted to have her own place in the world. And if you think about when the show was made, it's probably because she worked in a munitions factory or some other kind of war supporting effort. So she understood the importance of having her own economic independence. And plus, she was married to a Cuban. And at that time, not Lucille Ball, the actress, not Lucille Ball, the glamorous movie star, but Lucy Ricardo, the working class, maybe middle class woman who dared to marry outside her race in a way that would be illegal in 13 states. So this was someone who had her own power. And the show was such a phenomenon that with her own innovation, with she and Desi Arnaz's own entrepreneurship, they created reruns just by insisting that the show be shot on film, getting Carl Freund to agree to help them put together a way to do that technologically, because at that time it was not possible to link 3 cameras with one sound source and have it all sync up. They figured it out, or they got Carl Freund to help them figure it out. So because of that, they were able to create reruns and thus form the whole business of TV. So Lucille Ball was not only an interesting character on TV, she was also quite the power dynamo who was no one to be messed with. And remember, she would eventually buy the old RKO studios where she used to be a chorus girl. Talk about, in real life, being a center of power. Now we get into the 1960s and you start seeing Elizabeth Taylor almost single-handedly changing American mores when she first goes from being the widow Todd, stealing poor innocent Debbie Reynolds' crooner husband Eddie Fisher, and then getting the public's forgiveness by nearly dying of pneumonia, while becoming the highest paid actor ever with $1 million contract for Cleopatra, to having an affair with Richard Burton during the making of Cleopatra, and not having the public care at all once Richard Burton and she had gotten divorced and had gotten married themselves. And then she appears in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, playing down her natural beauty, playing up a side of anger and sluttiness inside herself that nonetheless made her into an even greater icon, even though it might have hurt her box office wise. Get into the 70s and you see another type of powerful woman, the liberated woman, Jill Clayburgh in An Unmarried Woman. You see the 80s, you see movies like Terms of Endearment, Trip to Bountiful, all of these pictures that are driven by strong female leads. In the early 90s, you have a little bit of a stumble, but not really. And that is Frank Marshall's version of Pretty Woman, where, yes, you have this kind of rather terrible messaging that if you want to hook a millionaire, become a prostitute, not necessarily a good message, but look who's doing it. It's Julia Roberts, who had something that was very unusual at that time, and that was someone who could be gentle, but also had an inner core of steeliness that allowed her to go back to the store that had dissed her and say to the snobby clerk, you know, yesterday when you refused to serve me, well, bad mistake. Now, audiences cheer for that, but that wasn't a wuss who could pull that off. Now, Julia Roberts was interesting at that time because we were coming off a period of women who were becoming very, very tough in a masculine way, but very good at it. For example, Sigourney Weaver in Alien, Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs. These were women who were put into challenging situations and rose to the occasion beautifully. But they could still be hurt. They could still make mistakes. They could still be in danger. They could still be scared. And then we come to the modern era. We come to the modern era, which is where I feel that modern Hollywood now hates women. Because what has happened to the role of woman? Let's start with on-screen. By and large, that A picture, that movie that's dominated by emotionality, by people who rise to challenges, has all but been abandoned. What has replaced it is more cartoonish stuff. Now, we can understand that because there is indeed the need to perform well at the box office. And in order to perform well at the box office today, in today's environment, you really do want to include the foreign element if you possibly can. Note I said if you possibly can. It doesn't have to be a 100% requirement, but it does if you want to have a big budget, because a lot of executives, let's face it, they get paid on how much they spend, not on how much they make. So there's a bad incentive to spend a lot badly because you get rewarded for it. You have a good minor hit, you get punished. because it's just not a big enough sum of money all in, even though you've made 5 times the money that was invested. Very screwy system, by the way, when you start rewarding bad behavior and punishing good behavior. So anyway, what started happening was when the Wall Street invasion happened, not only did it replace almost all the D girls in Hollywood. D girls were predominantly females and gay men who would work in the development ranks. And while they were in the development ranks, would shepherd projects from concept through pretty much the start of production, and often overseeing them into physical production through the dailies, and then through editorial and post. So these were people who usually knew movies well and understood sometimes the quirkiness of Hollywood. Well, when the Wall Street invasion happened, most of those were replaced almost immediately by Caucasian males with Ivy League degrees who really thought of movies as being stupid. I'm not gonna pull punches here because I work with these guys, and not only did they think that movies were stupid, but they thought moviegoers were stupid and nowhere near as accomplished and soigné as they were. This is a problem. This is also a problem because it meant that they weren't going to make movies for the general audience. They were going to make movies so they could boast to their friends about how much they were spending, because they didn't really care, right? And I know that sounds hyper negative. Just look at the behavior of what's been happening. Look at the kind of movies that get made constantly. You see this attention to only doing certain kinds of films that are big and robust and usually had male leads. Well, obviously, with Harvey Weinstein pretty much cornering the market a little bit nefariously, by the way, because he would bribe out people who were any kind of a threat to him. Don't think that he was just a jerk toward women. He was a jerk toward anybody who wasn't him. And yes, he cornered the market on art movies. And he cornered the market on the Academy Awards, which is why today the Academy Awards are a joke, because all anyone says when they think of the Academy Awards is, I don't want to see that movie. Why did that win Best Picture? Oh, it's the Hollywood elites. They don't care about us, which is true. But what ended up happening was once the Me Too stuff hit, now all of a sudden, even the Harvey Weinstein kind of movies, the Shakespeare in Loves, weren't being made anymore. And this gave an incentive for people to not do it. On the other hand, you still have 50% of the population being female. And you have your pretty much I'm a master of the universe type guys, the bros of the C-suite, deciding, well, we're going to take advantage of what's going on with the Harvey Weinstein thing and try to bring women in under a different way. Because obviously we have these franchises that are enormously successful, but they're primarily appealing to males, A pictures. So we need to do pictures that are A pictures with women in it. So what they started doing was replacing male characters with women. We all know what happened with Ghostbusters. We all know what happened with the Terminator movies. We all know what's happened with Star Wars. And even though you have the publicity people working 24/7 to put out this message that these are strong women, the truth is they're not. They're super people. And yes, they have that pejorative name, a Mary Sue. And what a Mary Sue means is it's someone who is strong and powerful without having any effort. One of the things that drives drama is the challenge that the main characters go through in order to achieve whatever they achieve. That's where the audience bonds. It's not that you're a kick-ass person who can go in and grab a guy by the wrist and bend it behind him because you're 5'2" and you happen to be an actress and you happen to have a stupid director telling you that that's going to get people to cheer. No, because everyone's going to look at that and say, I don't believe it. So you're going to have a real negative impact from that. You have people who absolutely will not go to movies with those female leads. Of course, the C-suite, once again, your Ivy Leaguers say, well, that's because most of the audience is a bunch of sexists. Can we say you do not win any kind of a battle by calling your core audience a bunch of sexists. That's a stupid move. But it's also an anti-female move, because in the process of doing all of these movies with women who come across as being highly negative to the average viewer, both male and female, maybe not in coastal cities, among the suburban Karen class, but certainly in the flyover states, certainly in other countries. People don't want to see that. They want to see people who struggle to achieve, not who are handed grace and get revenge for thousands of years of previous history. And in the process of doing that, what has happened is now female stars are worth less than ever. Look at what's happening with Jennifer Lawrence in her most recent movie. How is that movie being sold? It's being sold on the fact that Jennifer Lawrence runs around naked in it, or at least undressed, or at least sexy. Oh, it's an adult movie. What are you doing to Jennifer Lawrence? That is not her appeal. You might think you're going to get some horny teenage boys to go see it, which you're not. Remember, the key audience for Baywatch was always females 35 plus. It was never male. Pamela Anderson, Yasmin Belief notwithstanding. And that's a truth. So when you make these movies that do not appeal to women at all and really don't appeal to men anymore, what are you doing? You're saying that women are box office poison, every bit as badly as 1938 when Joan Crawford and Katharine Hepburn and Greta Garbo and these other stars were declared box office poison. Why are you doing this? Why is Hollywood doing this? And I'll tell you another example of how you can tell that Hollywood does hate women, especially women who fill in A pictures. What was one of the biggest movies of 2017? I know it's 6 years ago. Too bad. It's a perfect example. Hidden Figures was a movie that came out that had Black woman leads who admittedly were human calculators helping the NASA mission. Anyone who says that's the only reason that movie did well is an idiot. I'm gonna say it. You know why? Because that's not why that movie was a success. They could have been working in a bakery. They could have been working in an accounting firm, and the movie would have still done well. You know why it did well? Because you had women in it who were in a position that was lower because of something they couldn't control. Two things they couldn't control: their gender and their race. And what ends up happening? They end up scoring. They end up scoring despite challenges in their private life and in their public life. And the movie did gangbusters. It made all sorts of profit, way above expectation. Did Hollywood say, wow, look at how much money this movie made? Did Hollywood say, we should make more of these? Did Hollywood say, you know what, we're seeing a gap that's opened up here because this movie way outperformed with Caucasian audiences. And you know what else? This movie performed really well in Europe, even though there was nary any CGI that people could really discern. I mean, we know there was a lot, but none of it was done in the name of bling. And yet this movie performed overseas. Why did it perform overseas? Now, one of the reasons it performed overseas, because each territory took the time to say, all right, how does this story tie in with what women are going through in our country? Because let's face it, in every country you have this situation where there seems to be unequal access to success. And here's this movie, which you could watch it in Japan and understand it. You could watch it in France and understand it. Watch it in Germany and understand it. You could watch it in Brazil and understand it. Maybe a little bit differently. Maybe you have to do your secondary marketing for it a little bit differently. But the bottom line is that movie scored big time and was ignored. And yet we keep seeing race swapping. We keep seeing gender swapping. We keep seeing ways that women are diminished in terms of their star power and their real ability. And it's a tragedy. Now, let's talk about another side of this that's equally insidious, and that is the propaganda that goes out that tries to flatter younger people in the industry by making it seem like this is the most progressive generation ever, and that these people who are now in charge of creating your entertainment are the only time that the industry has ever been filled with people who are concerned about social issues. I mean, that's about the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. But you hear it put out there constantly. For example, I don't ever need to hear again that Kathleen Kennedy is the strongest woman ever in show business. No. The answer to that, there's 3 people who could have qualified for that, and not one of them is named Kathleen Kennedy. The first of them was Lucille Ball, and I'm going to hand it to her, and I'm going to say that it's probably her. I know Mary Pickford helped found United Artists, but she didn't have the kind of impact Lucille Ball had overall. Lucille Ball, when she bought Desilu, which used to be the RKO Studios, by the time she sold it to Paramount so that they could take out that wall that used to divide the 2 studios, she made the biggest corporate sale in California history up till that moment. She ran that studio. Moreover, as one of the stipulations of the sale, she insisted, and this was at the point when she already heard that they were calling her Lucille Testicles, and they were talking about what a bitch she was and how horrible a human being she was and how she wasn't a woman and all of that. She knew they were saying that. So she decided to put an extra screw on them. And she says, okay, guys, you want to play that game? I'm going to play that game. I'm going to say, you got to keep these 2 shows on the air at least 1 more year. How's that? And I'm going to stick on that. I'm not going to back down. And she didn't. And you know what those 2 shows were? Legendarily, they were Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Can we say that Paramount is around today because of those 2 shows? So yes, Lucille Ball, as the first woman who owned her own studio, should be, I think, the big one. But there were 2 others. One of them was Sherry Lansing, who was the president of Paramount during the era when they were making movies like Fatal Attraction. The other one was Dawn Steele, who was the president of Columbia Pictures. So you've got 3 women who almost 40 years ago showed how this could be done. So the fact that their histories tend to be very erased by people today is another example of how Hollywood and the entertainment media complex doesn't like women. It likes women who fit the right cliche or who fit the publicity story of the moment. But let's face it, when Kathleen Bigelow did The Hurt Locker and got fully into the manosphere in terms of genre, she'd done really well in that before. I mean, come on, look at her previous movies. I mean, I personally really think Blue Steel was pretty darn sensational, and Near Dark. You know, all of these movies were very good of hers. What does she win her award for? She wins her award for Hurt Locker. What's the problem with Hurt Locker? Hurt Locker was a big failure at the box office, Best Picture notwithstanding. So how about some of the others? You have a lot of women, particularly in television, who are very, very high performers. But what's happening today? They're getting diminished. Think about what happened with Shonda Rhimes at Disney. Thank God Shonda Rhimes was in her year of yes, when she was going to say yes to anything, or at least not saying no to any offer. She's running 3 shows on ABC, and Netflix makes an offer to her, and she's thinking about it because it's her year of yes. But she's still working on these 3 shows. What happens right in the middle of that? She calls, friends are coming into town. She calls the Disney rep and says, hey, we'd like to get some tickets for Disneyland. And the Disney rep says to her, don't you think we pay you enough money? That really happened, by the way. Why do you think that happened? With a woman who had 3 major shows on the air, one of your most important people, and you're going to say, don't you think we pay you enough money? That shows what people really think. That shows what people really think behind closed doors. I know what people say behind closed doors because I was in a lot of meetings with upper level people who were C-suiters. And trust me, they would say the most racist things. For some reason, they'd forget that I was an Asian sitting there in the room with them and hearing what they were saying. Plus ça change, c'est plus la même chose, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same. So when I say that Hollywood hates women, I'm saying it because when they have an opportunity to present women in their highest and best place, when they have the opportunity to put them in a higher position, it doesn't happen. And when you catch someone at the wrong moment, they'll tell you what they're really thinking. And you got to trust that. Do I think women have a future in Hollywood? Absolutely. I think women make great studio heads. Further, I think that a lot of women absolutely really understand the secondary side of creativity. What's the secondary side? Not the obvious. They understand what's going to hook an audience and reel them in. And yet, those aren't the people who are being searched for development. Those aren't the people who are being searched for creative content. So guess what? Leaving assets aside, trying to take an asset that's really good and put it in the wrong slot. Chloe Zhou, Eternals, absolutely the wrong movie for her. If you want to be conspiratorial, I'd say someone did that deliberately to trash her career and then be able to say, this is why we don't want to hire Chinese women to direct big, important pictures anymore. Trust me, that has been said about her. The way she was treated, the way she was taken out of her comfort zone and offered something that she could not do well in is another sign. It's almost like you're being gaslit. Anyway, something to think about when you hear Hollywood say, oh, but we really support women. Oh, we're really looking for more female-centric project. Look at the actions, not the words. And as of right now, the Hollywood of today hates women more than they ever have. Old Hollywood loved women because they brought in the audiences.
Slow curtain, the end.